All right. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Melissa Deal and with the NTAC and Charlotte, hello.
Good morning, everyone. At least on the Pacific Coast, it's still morning. So welcome. Thank you for being here with us.
Charlotte and I are really excited to be with you today to talk about data use and sharing part 2. Hopefully, many of you had the pleasure of hearing from some of our state folks from Missouri and Iowa about how they are sharing and using data collaboratively between vocational rehabilitation and education. Charlotte and I had the pleasure as well a few weeks ago to do a session that was kind of foundational on a high level overview of what data the Vocational Rehabilitation Agency collects and what data education collects and where those opportunities for alignment and collaboration are. So if you missed that one, we'll have that posted on our website in the coming week. So feel free to join that. But today we're just going to take a little deeper dive and really get more into data use and how we use the data.
Yeah, and so with that in mind, we're going to talk about how to use data to inform strategic planning. That is the purpose of all of us coming together, and to think about using data to help those programmatic decisions. And additionally, we're going to put this specifically in the context of using the VR performance measures and the state performance plan, annual performance report, transition indicators, also known as the SPP APR, and how we can use those data for strategic planning within special education and vocational rehabilitation. And then lastly, we're going to share with you some best practices for data sharing and decision making across agencies, which we think will really support the work that Missouri and Iowa shared with you this morning that they've been doing. So we always like to start these conversations grounded in the statutory purposes of each of the acts that oversee both special education and vocational rehabilitation. For IDA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, this has been well established since 1976, right? To ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education related services designed to meet their unique needs. That's our cornerstone. The reason we're doing that is to prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. So that really is the reason that we're focused on what happens to students beyond high school.
And like Charlotte, under the VR program, we're governed by the Rehabilitation Act that was most recently amended under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act in 2014. And the purpose of the program is ultimately to increase the employment of individuals with disabilities in competitive integrated employment. And in order to do that, all the workforce systems have to provide opportunities for individuals with disabilities to participate in job-driven training to achieve not just employment, but quality outcomes. So this goes back to the VR program's founding principle that individuals with disabilities, including those with the most significant disabilities, are capable of achieving competitive integrated employment when they're provided with the right supports and services.
So everyone has federal reporting requirements, right? Both sides of the house, whether it's the VR side or the education side. On the IDA side, on the education side, we have the state performance plan. It has to be updated at least once every 6 years. And then that state performance plan is reported on February 1st through the annual performance report. And there are 17 indicators that specifically measure both compliance and results for the education side.
So likewise, in terms of federal reporting requirements under WIOA, the VR program is one of the core partners that are identified under that statute. So we are now subject to common performance reporting, as it is so lovingly referred to, and all the core partners have to report on the same common measure. So under WIOA, states are required to submit a unified or a combined state plan That's on a 4-year cycle with every 2 years a modification period. And additionally, the program submits a case service report that we call the RSA 911, and that's a quarterly report. So this quarterly report includes all the individuals receiving services under the VR program within that quarter. And that's submitted no later than about 45 days after the quarter's end. And then that all feeds into an annual report called the ETA 9169. And that includes the VR program's annual performance data, as well as the other core partners. That's due October 1st of each year. Okay.
So on the education side, there are 4 of the 17 indicators that are specifically related to secondary transition. B1 is the percent of youth who graduate. It's a results indicator. And so whenever there's a results indicator for IDEA, the state gets to set what their target is for measurement. B2, also a results indicator, percent of youth who drop out. B13 is the only compliance indicator related to secondary transition. It's the percent of youth with required transition components of the IEP. As a compliance indicator, the target is set at 100%, and that isn't changeable by the state. And then indicator 14, positive post-school outcomes, also a result indicator. The state gets to decide what their target is.
All right, and under WIOA, there are 6 primary indicators of performance that the VR program is measured and has to report on. And when I was describing that there's quarterly data that gets reported under the RSA 911 that feeds into that reporting, that measures, that reports on all the indicators with the exception of the effectiveness of serving employers, which is dependent upon how a state is approaching that measure. So the first measure is the percent in unsubsidized employment during the second quarter after exit from the VR program. The second measure is the percent of unsubsidized employment during the fourth quarter after exit from the program. The third measure is median earnings for those in unsubsidized employment during that second quarter after the program. And when I say unsubsidized, that is competitive integrated employment. The fourth measure is the percent of participants who obtained a post-secondary credential or secondary school diploma or its equivalent during participation or within 1 year after exit from the program. The fifth is the percent of participants who are earning or making progress towards that recognized credential or a measurable skill gain. And 6, of course, is the effectiveness of serving employers.
Okay, so we give you a little bit of that foundation so that if you're not familiar with the other agencies' reporting requirements, you've got some foundation to go into this conversation around using data. And we start with thinking about how do we use data to improve practice and outcomes? That really should be our goal beyond just reporting the federal reporting requirements, right? So starting with looking at your outcomes. What's your higher education enrollment? What's your competitive integrated employment rate? How about post-secondary education and training? How many of your students are leaving school going into post-secondary education or training? And then what does some other employment look like for your students? Of course, the component that's really critical for indicator 14, as well as I would think VR, is the percent of students who aren't engaged in any of these things, right? So it's not a federal reporting requirement, but it really is where rubber meets the road and where we can start to make change. And so just looking at those outcomes broadly and asking the question, are these data okay or are they not okay? So are these outcomes good? Are they not good? And if we don't like them, why? Why not? If we like them, why? Why not? So really starting with just those very simple questions. What are our outcomes? Are we okay with them? Are we not okay with them? And then what's contributing to what's good? What's contributing to what isn't as good? Is a great place to start the conversation. Then look at your graduation and dropout components. What are the definitions for graduation? What are the standards for graduation? What are the requirements? Do you have recovery and reentry programs that are specifically designed to support students returning to school, continuing in school? What are some of the reasons that parents and students give for why their student didn't complete their graduation requirements? Do you have alternative pathways in order to reach completion? On the VR side, what are your measurable skill gains, right? What are your credential attainments? What's being attained, what isn't? What are your median earnings, especially at second and fourth quarters? Missy, you want to elaborate on anything?
I think you're doing great.
All right. And then once we know those foundational questions, then we can really start to look at the in-school services and experiences. This is where the predictors of post-school success are so valuable to inform program decisions. Do we have strong interagency collaboration? That's part of what the Capacity Building Institute is all about, right? Is making those relationships, seeing where we can support each other, but most importantly, where we can support our students and youth. How do the IEP and the IPE work together, right? So is there congruence between the two, or are we fighting each other? Do we have different post-secondary goals established for the IEP than what's in the IPE? Are we making sure that in order to achieve the employment outcomes on the IEPE, then within the IEP, we have strategies, transition services in place to support those? What about pre-employment transition services and VR services? Are they evident? Are students receiving those services while they're in school with a purpose in mind to reach those post-secondary goals? And then do we have coordination of services occurring? So let's think about how to use the best practices for data sharing and decision-making across agencies. And again, you heard Missouri and Iowa speak about this morning. A lot of times we think of data and we immediately go to, well, there's a decision to be made because we have data. But in reality, there's actually some intermediary steps that we really need to stop and think about. Having the percent of youth who attain competitive integrated employment is great. Asking those questions about why is that good, why is it not, what contributed to it, starts to give us some information. And once we have that information, then we can start to make some actionable decisions. This can be done under the analysis or interpretation phase if you're thinking along the lines of data collection, data analysis, data interpretation. But at the local level, it's putting a face on those numbers. It's understanding what's happening behind those percentages and those numbers. It's identifying those actionable data, meaning what is it that we really have control over? What can we influence and what can we not influence? And then moving down into making a decision. So moving from data to decision without explicitly identifying the information and the actionable data can sometimes send us off rails into things that we really don't have the authority to change. Data use is always complex and it's an iterative process, right? It's part of a continuous improvement model. It's not just merely for compliance sake. We started this slide with very purposefully thinking about what are the questions that need to be answered. You're going to see lots of data sources. You're going to have lots of opportunity for conversation. Specifying what questions to answer can help drive those conversations in a meaningful way. Once you know what your questions are that you're trying to answer, then you can move into effective data collection, analysis, interpretation. Again, that's where that information forming comes from. It's where the actionable data becomes identified. Then we start to use our data to make decisions whether to change a program or to not change a program. And then that leads us back to the next set of questions. So that iterative process helps us not to waste time, not to waste resources, and to avoid just making haphazard decisions.
So as Charlotte was just kind of describing, what do we want to know? What do we need to know? Are we making an impact? So for example, our students who receive services from the Vocational Rehabilitation Program prior to exit from school, more likely to have a positive outcome a year later. How many potentially eligible students, so students who haven't yet applied for VR but are receiving pre-employment transition services, actually end up applying for other VR services, and what services are they receiving? We also need to understand the data collection requirements and how to define the terms and the limitations to our data. And some of our state partners this morning talked about just how important that was to really understand not just what they could get, but what it was that they were looking at and what it meant, right? So really understanding what those definitions are and those terms are. And it's really one of the reasons Charlotte and I are so passionate about helping you all understand all these points of intersection and alignment, as well as the distinction between the data that gets collected by each of our respective programs in special education and VR. Also, just knowing the limitations. When the data is bad, that's also really important, right? We've had some pretty stinky data in the VR program in 2017. So with the implementation of new performance measures came some growing pains. So that's really important to explain and have a conversation with your education partners when you're sharing data, so that they understand if there's these huge increases or decreases from one year to the next, whether or not that can really be validated, or if there's a reason behind that was cleanup of data, for example. And what comes from the information about the practices and procedures and the programs that surround the data being collected. So just having some context, maybe having a story to tell to your partners about what's happened to someone, maybe especially if you all share a student that you can kind of share a success story is also important too. And then just determining what data to be shared and used, how it'll be shared and used, and who will be using it for that purpose. And again, we heard some of that this morning about some of the ways to ensure from your partner's perspective, the data that they're going to share is going to be protected and used how they perceive it's going to be used.
Once we know what those questions are, we can move into the strategic planning component, right? And think about, well, what are the mechanisms for doing the data sharing and using data?
So it's hard to believe, but it's going to be 8 years since WIOA was signed into law, introducing, at least the VR program to all these new measures and this thing called pre-employment transition services. But it really changed the look and the feel of VR in a pretty significant way, particularly for students, but also in terms of how we interact with our education partners. And I think it really offered us a bit more of alignment in the ways that we measure and look at that way we can collaborate and share data across each other's indicators. So strategic planning is about evaluating how you are currently operating to develop and expand and enhance or refine or stop a practice, right? What's working, how do we identify our strengths? What do we want to know that we're doing that's working well? And on the flip side, where are those gaps? We can evaluate progress and outcomes, as well as analyze the impact that services are having at different levels, right? At the program level, the student level, and the service delivery level. So once we understand that impact, we can really start to then explore how we want to enhance or expand the current services, as well as providing that opportunity to incorporate what we've learned over the year, right? Especially with regard to, if we just look at the past few years with the pandemic, what have we learned about this pivot to moving to virtual services, and maybe what the benefits are, as well as some of those drawbacks, and what does that tell us in our data about what's happened? And it really allows us to prioritize the work and address the needs we've identified, so we can maximize the use of our resources and benefit students with disabilities. So when we think about strategic planning, really it can help us think through how to enhance our collaboration and engagement with our key partners. So whether that's VR, if you're in education or it's education, if you're in VR, businesses or other labor and workforce partners, community partners, many of them, we all have a similar charge, but maybe with a little different twist. So what's the best way we can all collaborate and share our information to improve programming and ultimately better prepare our students for success after high school? Strategic planning can also help us think about the data a little bit more, what it's telling us in terms of improving access for our students. What's it saying about equity and engagement for our students with disabilities? We can target to specific populations of students or geographic areas. There's so much that we can do to kind of really see what's truly happening and who might be benefiting and who might be not benefiting as a result of the way that we might be designing our service delivery system. So looking at some of those low attendance or low incidence populations and participation, if we know certain services aren't getting much participation or it's not yielding many results, why are we still doing it, right? We can start asking some of those deeper questions to help us really learn and lean into the design of our programs. All right. So when we think about the progress and impact of what we're doing and the outcomes for students with disabilities at the service level, what programs and services are yielding positive results? At the student level, some of our states are starting to use our UI or unemployment insurance wage data to do matching. So typically that's done for our performance indicators for folks who are in an IPE, but some of our states have said, well, you know what, we want to find out not just for those students, but our potentially eligible students who might not end up applying to VR. We want to do that same UI wage data match to see maybe they didn't come to VR because they're working, or if they're not, then that's telling us we need to do a better job of engaging and getting those students into the VR program to offer them more services. So different things like that are happening, which is exciting. At the program level, where are we allocating our resources and how those staffing patterns and dollars are being allocated compared to where the needs are that we're starting to identify through the data. So just looking at where those areas are for opportunities for growth, as well as areas where there might be higher ratios of student to teacher or student to counselors. And are there other data that you can access, like time studies, to see where the stop gaps are in processes that might be leading to attrition or dropout, right? So just needing to kind of look at where do you need to pivot and where are there areas of program expansion or the need for redesign.
So thinking about data sharing, right? To me, I think of data sharing as a gift. It's like giving a Christmas gift or a birthday gift. Once I give it away, what the person does with it is really none of my business, right? If they use it, if they re-gift it, I've let go of it. It's now up to them. Data sharing is that gift, right? But data using is that collaboration between the two to say, well, how are we going to use this gift of data? And so it's not letting go of it and just pushing it off into the wind or into the other agency. It really is a combined effort to think about how do we do this together so that it benefits both agencies, and most importantly, how it benefits all students.
So diving into developing a data sharing agreement, this is an area that I think most people agree is really important, but can find super challenging. And it was great to hear Iowa, and great that they shared their link. And we get lots of questions of states looking for examples of how they're sharing data or what their data sharing agreement looks like. So we recognize here at NTAC and are definitely trying to make that a priority to help states develop these agreements so they can work more efficiently and make better data informed decisions by sharing the information that exists instead of duplicating processes for its collection. So getting into the details about it, there isn't one right way to develop a data sharing agreement. However, there are some critical elements which are outlined here on the slide that you'll want to consider, including any type of data sharing agreement that you might develop. So starting with identifying the purpose and the intent of the data, right? Charlotte talked a bit about that earlier, and you'll kind of hear these themes as we go down this list here. Thinking about what data will be used for, why it's needed, right? Too much unnecessary data won't be useful to you any more than not getting the data at all. You'll also want to consider including key terms and definitions as we describe why that was so important, so that it's clear to both parties about what that data is, why it's collected, what it actually means, and really to avoid that any misconception or confusion. And just making sure that everybody is on the same page, right? Understanding what data is going to be shared, how it's going to be used for it, how you're going to protect the data, and then including the roles and responsibilities for everybody involved. When is it going to happen? Who's going to do it? What are they going to do with it, right? You know, how that all works out. And then how often will the data be shared, and what methods are going to be used to share that data? How's it going to be transmitted? Some states have systems that can work together. In other cases, it might be a secured file delivery system. Either way, how and when the data will be shared, it's really important to outline all of that and spell it out in the agreement. So just knowing, you know, I'm sure you all know how important that is, but just can't stress that one enough. So there's a great tools already out there. And a few years ago, the Department of Education and Labor put out a joint guidance tool on data matching and sharing. And there's an entire section on FERPA. And we always like to share that tool. It seems like it's one of those best kept secrets. So I'll throw it in the chat when I get a second here, in case you haven't had a chance to see that. But there's some good information in there as you embark on data sharing agreements.
Thanks, Missy. Part of what you want to think about in that data sharing agreement, of course, are what are the data sources? And Missy and I started out talking about the WIOA data sources through the performance measures, as well as the IDEA data sources through the indicators, so 1, 2, 13, and 14. But those are just the tip of the iceberg, right? With indicator 14, you know that you have to report different demographic groups. You can always break those down by race, ethnicity, by genders, by different disability categories, geographic locations. And if you start to do that across multiple sources of data, look at the richness of the story that you can start to tell and start to understand what that information is. And so we have here on the slide 14 or 15 different data sources that we brainstormed that most states have available to them, either at a state level and or a local level. So thinking about things like the comprehensive statewide needs assessment that VR requires, what information is in there that will inform your data use and program planning? What about family and parent surveys like indicator 8, or focus groups or interviews? These are data that are probably available within the state, maybe through the PTI, the Parent Training Information Center for the state. You may not have to go out and do the data collection, but there's a possible data source then that you can tap into to say, well, what are our parents saying about transition and interagency collaboration experiences? Annual performance reports for those, for indicator 14, 1, 2, and 13 as well. Look at the trend data. What's happening over time with those data? Are the same groups of students achieving outcomes, positive outcomes? Are the same groups of children and students not achieving positive outcomes? What about data from other stakeholder groups like your SRC or your Center for Independent Living, your parent centers, other agency organizations? Think about a lot of states add additional questions into the PSO data collection. A lot of local agencies are allowed to add their own post-school outcome data into those or questions into those data. What are some ways to improve schools based on the local questions that are being asked? Are students achieving work-based learning experiences and having those work-based learning experiences while they're in school? Think about other data that may be available across the state through other agencies, behavioral health, developmental disabilities, or your employment first data. Again, going back and thinking about what are the questions that we need to ask, and then who might have the answers to some of those questions, keeping in mind, as we've said multiple times, those limitations of the data and what the definitions are, to make sure that we're talking apples to apples and not comparing apples to kiwis or, you know, other botanicals.
All right, and this kind of slide coincides a lot with what Charlotte was kind of getting at, just looking at other points of data that we can look at, whether that's from advisory boards or focus groups or surveys, and how that can all really enhance and enrich the data that we're collecting, and what we're finding out, and how we can use it to improve services for students with disabilities. So meeting with representatives, as Charlotte was saying, the SRCs, independent living centers, you know, all that data that gets collected by the VR agency for the RSA 911 reporting. That's a great data set that is they collect much more data than gets reported in those indicators. So just having conversations and sitting down with each other about the data that might not be on a report, but is definitely available that you all can use in planning. And just what answers can data, including shared data, provide? So are students participating in summer programs, or finding more jobs, or keeping jobs longer? Are they receiving pre-employment transition services? And is there any type of a correlation between whether or not they're staying in school longer, or they're not dropping out, or they're more likely to have a better job, or what's happening? What do we know? How can we look and analyze those different data elements to see what's happening with our students?
You know, much of an underlying theme for the CBVI this year will be involving parents and youth. You know, if you're a state team that has a parent partner or has a youth partner on your state team, ask them what questions they want like to answer. What do they think other parents want to know? What do they think other students want to know? You know, if you've got local team members, ask the same question. What are we missing here? It's so easy to stay siloed at the state level without coming down into the district and into the school, and then ultimately to the student and family level. And so engaging those parents early in those conversations around the questions they want to answer will facilitate, again, having the information to make the decisions to drive the programming to improve outcomes. So again, talking about how will you use the data to enhance the provision of pre-employment transition services. And then I can't emphasize enough, looking at the data to identify how are we implementing evidence-based practices and predictors? Are we incorporating those components into the IEP, potentially into the IPE? Are we just assuming that they're happening? Are we intentional with that in order to affect those long-term positive post-school outcomes?
And some of those other questions that we might want to consider in thinking about how we might begin to analyze impact of what we're doing. You know, what do we want to know? What do we need to know? What story do we want to tell? You know, what are we hoping to accomplish? So we need to have baseline data, right, to be able to do any type of a comparison. So what are we going to use for that baseline data? And do we understand what it's telling us so that we have something to measure against? So just being able to answer some of those questions are going to help us identify if we have access to the data that we need. So some of the questions that we have here to consider thinking through, these ones are mostly related to the VR program. How many potentially eligible students are we serving? How many students with disabilities in the agency are being served as applicants and eligible individuals with an IPE versus those that are potentially eligible and only have access to those limited pre-employment transition services? If we see that we don't have a lot of those potentially eligible students becoming VR applicants, why are these students not progressing into the full VR program and making an application and getting determined eligible? Looking a little deeper, as we kind of shared earlier, what demographics aren't being engaged and getting access to application? Are there certain populations of students or certain geographic areas who are less likely to become a VR applicant or eligible individual and not get the full array or benefit of the VR program. Why are there so many more students with disabilities reported than those that actually receive a service, right? In the earlier webinar, that was one of the items that we were sharing, was just this growing disparity of students that are getting reported in the data, but are less likely to receive a service. So just making sure that you're on top of that, because sometimes if you don't look at that data, you don't know that's happening, right? And what pre-employment transition services are the agency providing, and which ones are you providing most often, you know, versus those that get provided the least? You know, one of the other things that we talked about was that counseling on enrollment and post-secondary opportunities was one of the least provided services, when that's the one thing we're really trying to push, right, is to enhance folks' skills, earn credentials, get into some of these post-secondary and training programs so that they're more likely to have a quality employment outcome. So it would seem more likely that we would want to really enhance and beef up those types of services, which give students with disabilities more information and access to those types of programs. And then what services appear to be leading students to better outcomes? All right, I think we can go to the next one. I think this is this one me too, Charlotte?
It is.
Okay, sorry. So I, you know, just some more questions here, because I love kind of thinking through all the different cool stuff we can kind of find out or want to investigate through the data. You know, how has the organization and its structure pivoted to meet the demands of those that are getting served, right? We saw a ton of pivots by both special education and VR and its partners during the pandemic. But how do we continue with that same flexible and nimbleness so that as our programs ebb and flow, we can constantly be looking at how we're responding to the needs and pivot the structure and the way that we're organized in order to meet those demands. Same thing with staffing patterns to align with the percentage of youth that are being served, right? And how many students are getting enrolled in programs or in school. What percentage of professional development activities are devoted to staff and providers serving youth, you know, or certain populations of students? If we know we're not doing so well with certain students with disabilities or certain students with specific needs, what are we doing to enhance those professional development opportunities so that we're more likely to have the resources we need to serve them? How are staff and providers being measured to align with the provision of services and the indicators that we just kind of walked through earlier? And then what types of training are we engaged in to ensure we're all engaged in addressing bias and issues of equity, right? And, you know, that we don't just do it to check a box, but that we are actually embedding and infusing it into our everyday practices. And then how are we measuring, right? Again, at baseline, what we know, and then what's happening as a result of that to ensure that we are creating and sustaining more equitable practices.
So giving you lots of questions to ask goes back to what are the questions that you need to answer, and how do you move beyond just the reporting piece, right? So thinking about on the education side, what are some of the trends for the last 3, 5, 10 years? You know, one of the nice things about having IDA not reauthorized since 2004 is that we have some stability in the indicator data. At least for indicator 14, that measure hasn't changed since 2009. And so you've got 10 years worth of data to look at to see, well, what is our trend? Who's enrolling and in higher education? Who's graduating? Who's dropping out? And a lot of people will say, well, you're comparing apples to oranges, Charlotte. Those are different groups of students. If nothing's changed, if your program hasn't changed, if you're not implementing new strategies, then what's the reason to think that there would be a change in those data based on just students alone? So digging into that onion, peeling back those layers and saying, really, what's happening here? What's happening with our competitive integrated employment? What's happening within our CTE enrollment? Sharing those initial questions with your VR partners and your other agency partners lets you establish questions that both agencies can benefit from. Look at your indicator 14 data, unpack, disaggregate those A, B, and C measures, get into that unreported fifth category around not engaged. Why are the students who are attempting to enroll in higher education not completing one term? Why are students who are starting out having competitive integrated employment not meeting the criterion for competitive integrated employment? It's because they didn't make 90 days, they're not making minimum wage, they didn't work an average of 20 hours a week. What is it that needs to be happening in order to support those students moving through? So thinking about, once you see what those trends are, how have the programs changed? What are the requirements, availability, access, right? Just as Missy's talking about with equity, especially around CTE, for example, which groups of students are engaged, why and why not? We just talked about that. What do you think is contributing to those? Again, asking the different partner groups to answer that question. What's contributing to students staying in school? What's contributing students to dropping out? What services does the district provide to contribute to enrollment in further education? Is there dual programming that's happening so that there's support as that student moves from high school into further education? And then what are the barriers that might be limiting competitive integrated employment, for example? You know, think about in rural school areas, rural parts of the country, sometimes the school district is the largest employer nearby. And if that school district sets the criterion of you have to have a high school diploma in order to work in the school district, and yet we have students who aren't able to earn a diploma, that's limiting their employability, right? So what are the barriers that prevent students from attaining some of the outcomes that they may actually have as goals?
Absolutely. So when we think about our collaboration between special education and vocational rehabilitation, you know, we're hoping that we're going to be making an impact and creating some change, right? And all that leads to more successful outcomes. And, you know, thinking about what kind of outcomes could result from such a collaboration and how can we start thinking about what that might look like, or where do we just start to kind of just get started with all of this. And one of the ways is to look at just students participating in work-based learning experiences. Are we seeing an increase in the number of students that are participating in those types of experiences? And what kind of experiences are they? Are they out in the community? Are they aligned with the labor market industry and the jobs that are in demand or are growing? Is there an increase in high school graduation rates or a decrease in dropout rates for students with disabilities? Do we see an increase in the number of students achieving those post-secondary goals and those that are enrolled in some type of post-secondary training or education or competitive integrated employment? All right. And after post-secondary education, are you seeing an increase in the number of students achieving the competitive integrated employment that's in line with their expressed career field? Are there more students with disabilities and are they achieving quality employment outcomes, right? So are they getting jobs that result in sustainable wages with health insurance and abilities to advance, right? They're not just a job, but a career. RVR and special education engaging more with business and community partners so that we're really preparing students to enter the workforce and that labor market, right? And so this isn't, you know, an inclusive or exhaustive list, but just some of the ways that you can start thinking about where this all aligns, you know. And I think the last session right before ours, where we had our Yeti group facilitating the conversation with our federal partners, I think was such a great message, because I think often we'll meet a deliverable of a satisfaction survey, or, you know, once a year at an annual review of a plan. we might ask for students' input, but we're not truly engaging those students every day in really understanding what they need, what they know is working or not working.
Absolutely.
This is just a resource that we thought we would share if folks aren't familiar with it, but it's a data tool that has for all of the VR programs in every state and territory, their program year data for 17, 18, and 19, and program year 20 is going to get published any day now, but you can take a look at that and see what's happening in your state, see how you compare in other states, look at what services are being delivered, how many students are getting served. So it's a nice kind of snapshot tool. And there's links to the PowerPoint that'll take you right to a webinar on understanding how to use the tool as well as the tool itself.
NTAC-C is not short on resources. And if there's a resource that you would like to have that you don't find and you have an idea for a resource, reach out to us. We'll work on developing something with you to meet your needs. These are just some of the resources around data use and data sharing that we have available on the NTAC-C website. And so again, if there's something that you're not familiar with, reach out to some of the TA providers. We can help explain what the resource is or connect you with a resource or develop one with you. This is how you can contact Missy and I. We will spend more time talking with you about data use and data sharing than you might really want to spend, but it is something that we're both passionate about and we both enjoy. So don't hesitate to ask questions. I think we have some time for questions now.
We do. So please in chat, just put your questions. And I know Missy and Charlotte would love to discuss anything with you. Missy, did you see Shannon wanted the link to the tool? Okay. All right. Thank you.
Grab it now.
Shannon, just a reminder that we can drop the link to the tool, but once you click on it, it's going to require you to log in. So just remember that.
I was going to cheat and take a different route if I can. Let's see.
You know what, Missy, don't worry about it. I can get the PowerPoint. I can get it from there.
Okay.
Any questions?
Or comments.
Or if you have idea for resources that you would like us to tackle. Like Charlotte and Missy said, we're always looking for ideas for new resources, aren't we? So.
Yep. I posted a link that'll take you to the PREETS data tool, but it'll also take you to the rehab data work group and some other tools on measurable skill gains, as well as I think they have one on, is the outcome one on here? I'm not sure. Yeah, employment status at exit. So if you're a data geek like Charlotte and I, you can just get lost in it.
Yeah, I think the questions that you all shared, Dale just mentioned, they're going to be helpful, and Deanne's encouraging folks to kind of look at those and use some of those within the strategic planning times.
Mm-hmm. I think, you know, I think because we're all so busy and this is such a crazy time in everybody's world right now, especially that it's really easy to just get through the day and do what we need to do, you know, to make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. And we don't often make time to kind of look at beyond, we know we have to report it, but then once we report it, you know, do we make time as a program, as an agency, as an organization to sit down and look at what did this data tell us? What happened this past year, right? I don't think we do that enough historically.
So Missy,
I think
this is Hey, Charlotte, can I break in here a minute?
Yes, please, Dale, go for it.
No, I think, Missy, I said, you made a great point. We were actually just talking about this with my developmental disability services counterpart and vocational rehabilitation counterpart, that, you know, with us still coming out of the pandemic and some people still not wanting to meet face to face, Zoom meetings are great to cut down on travel and wasted time traveling and everything. But again, I've been in so many where, you know, I'm sitting here just like this and I've got somebody knocking at my door and saying, okay, we've got an emergency. You've got to come down the hallway and we've got to talk about this, that, and the other. So then I miss most of what happens. So I think one of the things that we just talked about, you know, late last week and actually just yesterday was, we have to force ourselves to put time on the calendar and find a place and go lock ourselves in it where no one can get to us, you know, whether we sneak away and we don't let anybody know where we're at other than saying this is what's on our calendar and this is what we're doing. Because if we don't take that time, we never get to the data. Because as many of us are, we're one deep in our positions, and that's, we just keep getting pulled in other directions. But again, we can never improve what we're doing until we tackle that data piece.
Yeah, thanks,
So-
Dale. That's so true. That's the strategic part of the strategic planning, right? Being strategic in using your resource, which is you and your time, to be able to look at the data. So thank you for that reminder.
You know, I was thinking when you were talking, Dale, it was reminding me of, and I'm going to date myself, but just when, you know, I can remember doing things on triplicate forms and, you know, not everyone had a computer, so things wasn't so automatic. And then email, you know, became a more regular part of everyday business operation. And so instead of these natural points of a wait period where you could actually like then get work done while you were waiting for the next thing to catch up with it, everything started becoming this real time stuff. And I feel like now with Zoom and the virtual piece, it's kind of taken that up to the next level. And so we're all kind of just having to kind of adjust again to this different type of having to do things simultaneously. And it's not easy.
So maybe that becomes another part of our data sharing agreement, is how frequently we will meet in order to just look at data and talk about the data and set that up as the intentionality with that plan.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I think we don't often invite our folks that are experts in the data into the programmatic conversations. And so if I could put one more plug in there, being married to a data person and hearing them say all the time, you know, I always find out at the last minute what they need, but if they would have brought me in last year, I could have told them we could have done X, Y, or Z or whatever. And so I would just encourage you all to kind of think outside the box and beyond your just implementers and the program folks, and making your data people bring them in a little earlier than you normally would.
I think that was a point this morning, Missy, too, that Iowa and Missouri made too, making sure you have the right people at the table when you're having these conversations, and you get a lot further in terms of that process. So.
Yeah, I know for myself, like being a pro, I always have these huge waffling ideas, you know, and so you get too far down the road, and then the IT folks are like, no, you can't do that. Or, you know, you could have done this, you know.
Any other last comments or questions?
If not, it
Well,
looks like you've got a few more minutes in your break time.
Yep.
Get ready for
And I would
team
just
planning.
say, just feel free to reach out to any of us at NTAC. This is part of our charge, is to support you all with all things data and data sharing. It's part of collaboration, so we're happy to help.
And you two will both be at the extended learning, right, Charlotte and Missy? So if folks have more questions, so Um,
Well, there was
All
a
right.
question about the grade book.
Oh, yes. Charlotte, do you want to take that, the transition grade book tool? When you get this
Sorry,
set?
What's the question? I lost my,
Yeah, it says, when you get this set up, is it possible for both VR and education reps to access the data from the transition grade book?
I'm going to say the short answer is yes. And if Matt Clare is still on the call, Matt is the brainchild behind that tool. Can't find my participant list.
I'm trying to,
Is Matt still here?
I do not see him, Charlotte.
So I think the short answer to that is yes, and looking at accessing it from both agencies. I'll confirm with Matt.
Awesome, thank you. All right, well, thank you, Charlotte and Missy, and we look forward to continuing the conversation at the extended learning. And we have a small break, and then it's time for strategic planning. Yay! So, all right, bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day.